Thank you for coming in this beautiful weather where it's better to stay outside in the sun. I really appreciate it. In 2003, Palestinians went to the street in protest of public disorder and chaos that reigned in the West Bank and Gaza Strip since the Second Intifada as a result of continuous militarization of the Palestinian society and the unlawful actions of many armed Palestinian militias. The Prime Minister at the time of the Palestinian Authority, Ahmed Kurea, literally joined the manifestation in the street and expressed support for the protesters' quest for more public safety and order, the Prime Minister himself. So it makes you wonder who governs the West Bank and Gaza Strip. In 2006, when Hamas won the legislative elections and formed a government under Ismail Haniyeh, one of the main sources of conflict between Hamas-led government and the PA president was about the government's level of involvement in PA's, the Palestinian Authority, public finance, money, Palestinian foreign affairs issues, and security and civil service personnel. Again, it makes you wonder who governs really the West Bank and Gaza Strip. In 2012, many Palestinians went to the street protesting some of the then PA Prime Minister Fayyad financial policies, in particular his plans to increase prices of certain basic goods. President Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, was quoted talking about a Palestinian spring in sight. Again, it makes you wonder. Just recently, a so-called Israeli coordinator in the West Bank and Gaza, Yoav Poli Mordechai, announced that fishing area is extended on Gaza's beach for 6 more miles, which will result in an additional 400 million shekels on the annual income of fishing in Gaza. Again, it makes you wonder. So this presentation, with its fancy title and abstract that was, I suppose, sophisticatedly written, is an inquiry, an investigation about one simple question. Who governs the West Bank and Gaza Strip and how this is working? While the question is simple, the answer is very complex because it involves territoriality, ethnicity, nationality, religion, services provided, persons, gender, language, IDs, travel documents, citizenship status, areas of residence, etc. So I do not promise to provide a comprehensive answer to this simple question, but I plan in this presentation to provide possible approaches for the inquiry that I personally tried. There are arguably 2 ways to look at governance as a process of governing, and as a result to perceive the role of constitution as mechanism of decision-making indispensable for governance. We either look at governance as government or as effective control. The views about governance and constitutions affect our views about the place of written constitutions, about law, rule of law, about judges' role in jurisprudence, about popular involvement or their marginalization, about parliament's place and the role of otherwise neglected institutions in the theory, such as the presidency, the army, the constitutional court, about accountability of government to domestic constituency, and about the dependency on international foreign and aid policies. For example, in the literature recently, many have criticized the EU foreign policy aiming at supporting rule of law in Palestine, mainly because it subscribes to the Oslo framework, excluding any consideration in their policy of the Israeli occupation as an important variable. And despite the fact that of the undemocratic character of the PA. Another example is the coexistence of apparently what we call independent judiciary. The adoption of judicial review in Palestine by a Supreme Constitutional Court that recently President Abbas formed the court, while at the same time courts and the judiciary and judicial review is also supporting a kind of authoritarian regime in the PA. Another example is that all law professors live, like myself, is that schizophrenic approaches in legal education to constitutions and to governance, where theoretical legal and constitutional studies and jurisprudence remain completely disconnected with the reality of power relations. So I start first with governance as government. There are typically, within this framework, two ways to consider governance as government. You either look at the constitutions or otherwise you observe the behavior of the main political actors. Constitutions, and in most countries now written constitutions, provide a more or less comprehensive guideline on who governs and how government functions. Because of the nature of constitutional provisions and as legal provisions generally, we often tend to forget that legal and constitutional rules are by definition normative. Instead of describing who governs in reality, they include prescription about who ought to govern and how government ought to function. This is why it is often the case that interest shifts to real-life constitutions, where a different narrative about who ought to govern based on who governs in reality, and a different narrative about how government ought to function based on how government functions in reality. Arguably, those two approaches make sense for a legal positivist and a realist respectively, with consequences on the methodologies and on the results of the analysis. For our purposes, this distinction will be marginal, as we will refer to constitutional principles, rules, and institutions that were consolidated by the actions of main political actors. Most importantly, I will not bother making the distinction between positivism and legal realism, because, as I'll argue later on, those two approaches anyway fail to provide a coherent and comprehensive account about governance, and because governance as government simply didn't work in Palestine for reasons that I'll try to explore later on. I will not go through all of them. I just selected some of them, but those are the characteristics if we adopt the approach of governance as government. I go directly to democratic government. There is no consensus about what democracy means. It is often the case that democracy is distinguished between formal and substantial democracy. A formal conception of democracy is narrow and is often presented as to mean that system of government where free elections take place and where decisions in government depend on majoritarian choices. A substantial conception of democracy often includes guarantees for political minorities where periodic election ensure alteration in majorities and minorities in ways that justify the consideration of majority choices as basis of decision in government. It is safe to argue in both concepts of democracy that the Palestinian Authority passed the test of democracy formally or substantially conceived. Second, I will consider representative government. Democracy is rarely exercised directly by the people, but indirectly through representatives. Again, the PA is no different from this tendency overall. Presidential and legislative election took place in 1996 and in 2005 and 2006. The PLC the Palestinian Legislative Council, was mandated with the power to legislate in cases of necessity, and the president can adopt decree law subject to confirmation by the PLC. So far, it's a regular example of any semi-presidential regime. It's a constitutional government. The basic law is adopted, it's written, unified constitution, and it included, despite some missing and contradictory provisions, the content of the text and the way the main political actors, including the courts, implemented it. It suggests that this basic law is superior to any laws in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and it is the supreme law of the land. It limits the government, theoretically. I'm talking about a system that is theoretically in place. Also, it adopted a limited government with the adoption of semi-presidential regime. It's not like UK parliamentarism, nor like the US presidentialism, but it gives the impression that in Palestine we have an example of semi-presidential regime. Again, with some differences that make all the difference from France. Also, it fits within constitutionalism as a theory, suggests that states are also obliged and limited in their options. Again, a constitutional government is not any kind of government, but a government that departs already from, for example, egalitarian and non-discriminatory basis. And we see that the PA adopted such kind of system. All looks good so far. It is also considered one of the best liberal constitutions in the Arab world. It was welcomed with enthusiasm by lots of constitutionalists at the time. The Basic Law was considered as the most liberal constitution much way before the Arab Spring. Now, the second approach is to look at governance as effective control. The effective control idea departs from the elephant in the room, the ugly leviathan of the extraordinary and the exception behind the beautiful face of normality and the ordinary. The power behind governmental authorities, the state, which is not here as dealt with as sovereign nation state. I'm not talking here about Palestine, whether it's state or not. But a state refers to that entity that is on the background whenever we talk about government, to that legal order that monopolizes the legitimate use of order, of force, to that unity, stability, and existence that is being protected, valorized, and given priority over any other principles of government. Now, positivist and realist approaches helped us individualize the characteristic of government in a similar way that a pair of glasses helps individuals better see the surroundings, regardless of whether the clear view they see is that of a real world or not. The second approach I suggest here as governance as effective control is instead a panoramic view of Palestine, done a little bit from the sky with the help of a telescope. While harmony and clarity and unity, I should remember to switch. While harmony and unity are the characteristics of a surrounding that is viewed with help of glasses, the telescope and panoramic image does not show unity and harmony, but fragmentation and chaos. As a result, assuming the unity of the legal order as point of departure for the analysis of governance and constitutionalism in general is at best aspirational and at worst misleading. Instead, in this section, pluralism will be used as point of departure for the discussion of governance as effective control. While there are, of course, differences in the way pluralism is used in the literature, as normative pluralism, state legal pluralism, and legal pluralism tout court, in what follows, I'll use legal pluralism only as an alternative approach to understanding legal and constitutional phenomena in Palestine. As a result, it is suggested that the place of written constitutions and the role in governance-related decision-making need to be revisited. And what we see if we look from this perspective, we see a fragmented government. Palestine was indeed divided in 3 political units following the end of the British mandate in 1947-1948. The State of Israel was established as a result of the war over most of historic Palestine. Gaza and the West Bank were under 2 different administrations and received completely different treatments by Egyptian and Jordanian authority respectively. The Israeli occupation maintained the legal administrative fragmentation of the 2 areas, dealing with them as 2 separate entities under 2 separate military and civil administration and 2 separate ID systems. East Jerusalem was separated from both West Bank and Gaza Strip too. With Oslo Agreements, Israel intensified the permits regime and dealt with Gazans and in the West Bank as foreigners, both Palestinians within the occupied Palestinian territory. I'm not talking about refugees outside the occupied Palestinian territory, who need permit to remain in the other region, West Bank Palestinian in Gaza and Gaza in West Bank. The unilateral withdrawal from Gaza was done without coordination with the Palestinian Authority and resulted in a completely different reality on the ground between West Bank and Gaza. The Hamas coup in 2007 is accordingly not out of context. It simply makes sense. Accordingly, it is wrong to suggest it is the result of a Hamas-Fatah dichotomy, or even as being a fight over power or government. It is actually structurally more than that. Since 2007, Hamas controlled Gaza and PA President Abbas controlled the West Bank. And now we talk about consensus government under Rami Hamdallah, but he's not governing the Gaza Strip, despite all the good and declared intentions. So while theoretically Gaza Strip is part of the occupied Palestinian territory, and despite the withdrawal of Israel from most of Gaza Strip, the West Bank is still mostly under Israeli control. There's the distinction that need to be maintained. Oslo Agreements divided West Bank in areas A, B, and C. Area C is completely under Israeli civil and military control, while Area A is under PA control Area A, while Area C is under Israeli control completely, and Area B, only civil administration is done to the Palestinian Authority. So the fragmentation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the stripping of East Jerusalem, and the division of areas A, B, C, coupled with building settlements that never stopped but instead intensified after Oslo, rendered what we say two-state solution impossible. So we talk about everything when we talk about governance in Palestine. I'll talk about it later on. Maybe the alternative is not necessarily, in case of the failure of the two-state solution, the alternative is not a one-state solution necessarily. I'll say why later on. I'll skip some of those aspects, but if anyone is interested, we can return back to them later on. I'll go directly to a dependent government, not autonomy. There is no autonomy. We talk about autonomous territories, but there is no autonomy there. Functionally, the PA is limited to those functions explicitly transferred to it by military and civil administration as a result of Oslo Accords or subsequent agreements and understanding. Those functions are not transferred, remains exclusively for Israeli military and civil administration to determine. For example, all issues related to foreign commercial and exchange are subject to Israeli unilateral control. Paris Protocol is an example of a bilateral agreement that institutionalizes such one-directional dependency of the PA on Israel. Israel also controls uniquely and unilaterally the borders of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. After the withdrawal from Gaza, an EU police mission served as a neutral observer to the implementation of the Rafah crossing agreement, where actually Israel could control with the closed-circuit cameras. And after Hamas arrived to power, the EU mission left Gaza, and now Rafah crossing is controlled unilaterally by Egypt. It's not a crossing point, actually, it's a closure door, better to describe. It's a door that is mostly closed all the time. Gazans in the West Bank still need a special permit from Israel and Jordan to use the Allenby Bridge, that is the West Bank crossing point. Entry and exit of goods are under direct Israeli exclusive control of the West Bank. The movement of the Palestinians, including their leadership, the PA President Abbas, when he wants to go to Jordan, he needs Israeli permits, and he passed through Israeli checkpoints. The same applies with Rami Hamdallah, Prime Minister, every day going from Tulkarem, that is a West Bank city, to Ramallah where he works. He passes through several checkpoints. His car was once fined by Israeli policemen on Area C because they were driving fast, just to mention one example. Since the Second Intifada, Sharon imposed travel restrictions on the West Bank and Gaza Strip Palestinians, prohibiting their use of Ben Gurion Airport, while of course forbidding the building of an airport for West Bank and destroying the one that was in Gaza Strip, meaning that West Bank Palestinians need to go to Amman and Gazans need to go to Egypt so as to be able to take the airplane. If we look at the system of government, lovely words of limited government that I used often in my work, including in the paper I searched, Constitutionalism in Palestine, the title of the paper. In reality, what we have is an authoritarian government. Despite the appearance of democracy, the PA inherited authoritarian legacies of the past. So when we talk about the lack of separation of power, often we say this is because this is a Muslim or Arab country. But in reality, this is a legacy that we got from the British mandate. The concentration of powers was done or was put into the first constitution of Palestine by the British that gave all authorities to the British commissioner. The same applies under Jordanian regime. The same applies, West Bank was under Jordanian regime from 1948-1967. Gaza under Egypt, concentration of power, not separation of power. The military governor, who controlled all three functions of government, legislating, executing orders, and deciding cases by courts. But we have also something, Arafat, the first thing he did, or one of the few things he did immediately after he returned or started to govern West Bank, he established a security courts. He revived British emergency regulation in Palestine. The PLO President Abbas is using his emergency power under the basic law. So what we have is rule by the exception, not rule by the norms. And we contributed to concentration of power in one man or one person. Dictatorship also, since the British mandate, the legacy of successive governments of Palestine or part of it was a concentration of power in one person. Government by decrees. I'll mention something about Hamas arriving into power. And in 2007, after the coup, it's Hamas controlling completely Gaza by decree or by decisions of Hamas, and Abbas is controlling West Bank by decree. It's government by decree. About the West Bank Palestinian Authority, it's a precedent government. It's not, in literature, comparative constitutional law, we talk about semi-presidential regimes, different way, including minority government, how cohabitation is done, and etc. But in Palestine, there is no one giving confidence to the current government of the PA, and it's literally the president government. Now I'll go directly to the third. I skipped a lot. So I'll go to the third. Apparently I see. Flexible governance. This is a new approach that I would like to suggest possibly to adopt in order to understand governance in Palestine. The governance as effective control complicated the discussion about governance and constitution, compared to the rosy picture created by the governance as government. The second approach is, however, not conclusive, as in reality it doesn't help answer who governs the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It takes us to different direction. I suggest here that the problem is with the initial assumption about governance and constitution. So far, the point of departure was either government or the state. At the basis of both approaches is either the idea of an authoritative government or a legal government that result from effective control. Both approaches do not work in reality because they are up-down approaches to governance. Besides, we looked so far at constitutional and legal system assuming their unity and certainty, their hierarchically organized norms under a supreme constitution. It kills an idea of constitution, or within states framework. But in reality, the constitutional system in Palestine is anything but unity, harmony, hierarchy, and coherence. It is a matrix, I'll call it so far, a matrix of laws, rules, orders, norms, and institutions that cannot be truly captured unless we switch our concern from the government to the governed, from the state to the individual, from power to freedoms and rights. In other words, instead of asking who governs Palestine, the question becomes how individuals' choices are governed, their rights are exercised, and their liberties curbed. The answer will be, it depends. So for example, if the individual we are talking about happens to be an Israeli citizen, the law of the State of Israel, its basic laws, its protection, the state's protection, Israeli court's jurisdiction, follow him or her, the Israeli flag, follow this citizen in any part of Israel and in any part of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. There is no jurisdiction by Oslo Agreements and by force imposed on the PA. There is no jurisdiction for the PA whatsoever on Israeli citizens. When it comes to Palestinians, the answer is it depends who governs those individuals. It depends on what I will call now the three W's: who, where, and what. Or otherwise stated, the answer depends on personal, territorial, and functional aspects. In what follows, I'll show the legal matrix of governance under which Palestinians live by giving an example from Palestinians' daily life. Let's imagine a British citizen called Smith. He's visiting his 4 friends, Palestinian friends living in the West Bank city of Ramallah. I'll call them Sarah, Rami, Fatima, and George. Here's how their daily life may look like. First, the name. What does the name tell you? Sorry, is this one?
Yeah.
This one. So the name. We know who's female and male, of course, from the name, but we know from the names who can be Christian and Muslim. And this is important because of the stereotypes that is at the basis of many normative pluralism that we have. Like Sarah and Rami, we couldn't know if they are Muslim or Christian, but Fatima and George, we know that Fatima is Muslim and George is Christian. It doesn't matter for Smith. The name doesn't tell us anything. Let's assume that Sarah is a Christian Catholic, one of the 13 Christian communities recognized in Palestine. Rami is a Muslim Sunni, because this is the only recognized Muslim community in Palestine. And Fatima should be Muslim Sunni, and George Christian. Let's assume he's Greek Orthodox. Where they come from, let's assume Sarah comes from East Jerusalem. Rami from Ramallah, his family is refugee from Jaffa, but it doesn't matter, he's from Ramallah. Fatima is from Haifa, that is the city inside Israel now, and George from Gaza Strip. 4 Palestinians, 4 different status, 4 different IDs. There is one for Sarah, ID for East Jerusalem, one for, it's not only the color of the ID, it's all the rest, all the rights that is related to it. ID card for the West Bank, Rami. Fatima has Israeli citizenship, she is called Arab Israeli. And George has an ID card for Gazans. There are some Christians in Gaza. Just I wanted to say this to make George Christian, Greek Orthodox, because I want to tell that there are Christians in Gaza. Now, they didn't do anything. Can they stay in Ramallah or not? So you don't have to do anything to be in a legal position in Palestine. Actually, Sarah can stay. She's from East Jerusalem, can remain in West Bank city of Ramallah. But if she's caught, she may lose her ID. Rami can stay. Fatima cannot stay because she is entering under her own responsibility because she is protected as a citizen of Israel. She can't go in West Bank city, but if she goes, it's under her own responsibility. And George needs a permit. He's from Gaza in order to be in Ramallah. Now, the second question, if they want to decide to marry, who can marry who? Of course, I'm not talking about Rami and George or Fatima and Sarah. This is out of question now in Palestine. But it's even between when there is gender differences. It's not obvious. Like Rami, like Sarah, she can, I need to see my PowerPoint so as I see what you see. Sarah, she can marry Rami because the church permits under special circumstances and she needs a permit. And she can now marry George. There's no problem now, but 50 years ago she needed a permit so as to marry a Greek Orthodox. Now, Rami, he has no problem, he can marry Sarah. She's Christian because in Islam and personal status law that applies in Palestine, he can marry a Christian and a Jew, female, without problem. But he cannot, by personal status law, marry outside those 3 religions, Muslim or Christian or Jew. Fatima, she can marry Rami, but she needs to think twice before loving or falling in love with George. Because personal status law says she cannot marry a non-Muslim. So her choices are the following. She has 5 options. She may convert, George may convert to Islam, and then they marry as Muslim. Right? Yes, it doesn't matter. And Israel applies the same personal status law. This is the importance of. In some areas, there are similar rules between Palestinians. It matters gender.
I'm sorry, I need to read it, but she cannot marry a non-Muslim as an Israeli citizen.
Yes. because personal status law still applies for Muslims, applies in Israel also.
Is it the same part of the Majalla, right, that applies on all areas?
There is a Jordanian personal status law that was adopted by Palestinian, the only law that is adopted in 76 after the end of the Jordanian rule. I got your attention, that's great. So she has 5 options. George can convert to Islam and that's resolve the problem. Fatima can convert to Christianity and get married to George in church. But her conversion to Christianity nor her marriage can be recognized by Palestinian law. Fatima may stay Muslim and marry George in church. Her marriage wouldn't be recognized, and thus their children won't be recognized as they will be natural kids but not recognized legitimate kids. 4th option, Fatima and George can go to Cyprus if they can afford it, marry there, and return, recognize the marriage as a foreign marriage under reciprocity rule. And the 5th option, the simplest one, is to forget about George. Now, the hereditary matters. Who decides hereditary matters? There is personal status courts. For Catholics, it's a Catholic Church court by priests. For Rami and Fatima, there are Jordanian-based personal status laws. And for George, there is an Orthodox canon law courts. The funny thing, when it comes to hereditary rules, like how much a female gets, all of them impose the Sharia division, like 2 portions, or the female gets half of what her brother gets. Applied by the Christian court, Orthodox, Catholic, but the same rule that is Sharia based. What car they can drive? It appears obvious, but it's not. Sarah and Fatima, they can drive yellow license plate cars as much as Smith. Rami and George, they can drive a green license plate car with the letter F, distinguished cars. And Smith also can drive it. So Smith can drive both cars. But Palestinians need to choose which kind of car. Can they import cars from outside? Because we don't have this luxury to do cars. So yes, they can. But Sarah and Fatima, they pay only the Israeli customs. Rami and George, they pay extra. They pay the Israeli customs, but they also pay for the Palestinian Authority customs. So we are contributing to the Palestinian Authority budget through those customs, and Israel returned them to the Palestinian Authority. Now, who can give, which traffic police force can give them a ticket if any of them make an irregular thing on the street? Sarah, she is driving in the PA area of Ramallah. Sarah and Fatima with a yellow plate car, a yellow license plate car. The policeman cannot stop them, but he can do nothing. He can't enforce even a ticket. So you can imagine how they drive in Ramallah streets. But when they go in Israel, proper, they are very neat drivers or very good drivers. In Area C, all of them, all kinds of Palestinians. I'm talking kinds of Palestinians because the IDs make us different typologies. Look always at Smith. He almost can do anything that Palestinians altogether can do. He can choose. You know, the foreigner in Palestine can choose. Palestinians cannot, even those who have an Israeli ID. They have specific things to do. Can they enter Jerusalem? Some yes, some no. They can enter with their car. Only some specific cars, not the others. Who needs permits? Difference. Even when they go to Kalandia in the same car, 3 of them can stay in the car. Smith, Fatima, and Sarah. 2 of them needs to walk through that checkpoint of Kalandia.
Sorry, Kalandia is in between Ramallah
and East Jerusalem, occupied city of East Jerusalem. So if you, for example, if you are from West Bank Palestinian, you have a baby, and your husband is from East Jerusalem. The baby stay with the husband, driving husband, and the wife should go through, walking through. If you never saw a picture, just look it up. Pictures of Kalandia checking. You see how people cross that. Can they sleep over in Jerusalem if they have a permit? It's not obvious. Even if they have 24 hours permit, you cannot sleep over. It stays the permit. It's not included to sleep over. To travel abroad, there is differences here between East Jerusalem, Sarah, and Fatima. Sarah doesn't have a passport. She has a laissez-passer, 3 years laissez-passer. If she goes outside and stays outside occupied East Jerusalem, after 3 years she loses her right to re-enter. Not for Fatima, she's an Israeli citizen. She may lose her citizenship for other reasons, but not for getting out of that. Which exit points to use? Here again, there is difference. LMB Bridge for Palestinians, and including East Jerusalem. But Fatima, she needs to go to Sheikh Hussein crossing point with foreigners. Foreigners can go to Sheikh Hussein, to Ben Gurion, and LMB. All options are available. They can choose. Now, East Jerusalem Palestinians and West Bank Palestinians, when they arrive to LMB Bridge, they have different halls and different lines. West Bank Palestinians like myself, I go to the Palestinians hall. East Jerusalem and foreigners go to a different hall. No line, not much line. I don't know, but I heard that there is no much line there. Can we re-enter? Now it is possible for West Bank Palestinians to re-enter easily. Before Oslo, you have to have a permit to re-enter. You could be just left outside. But Gazans in West Bank, when they go out, they need a permit to re-enter from both Israeli and Jordanian authorities. Like this thing about the VIP service on the LMB Bridge. This is an accelerated process because of the line. People who are in hurry, they need to go to a conference, one-day conference, and they need to spend 2 days usually in the bridge. One to go and one to return back. So some of us decide to pay extra money so as to use the called VIP. It's not VIP, but it's accelerated process. Now, Palestinians like myself, I take the VIP service from Jordan. When I arrive to Israeli controlled part, I go to regular line because no VIP service for Palestinians of the West Bank. East Jerusalem and foreigners, they can go ahead as VIP within the Israeli controlled side of the bridge. No VIP for Palestinians of the West Bank system. Still have 6 minutes, and I didn't go through many of the things I wanted to go through. But anyway, so based on this example of daily life, the governing body is different depending on the area in which the individual concerned is present, whether in area A, B, C, or East Jerusalem, or Gaza, or within Israel proper. But also it depends on the ID, he or she, all Palestinians. I didn't talk about refugees outside, you may bear in mind. In some issues, religion matters. In others, the kind of the topic matters. And they all decide what governing structure is there. This legal matrix, as I like to call it, is very complex for the outsiders. But in reality, because it's reality confusing and subject to often arbitrary change that people live in person first or hear about it from other people who were unfortunate to first discover the procedures and rules changed. In other words, most rules like provisions that are governing Palestinians are unpredictable. For Palestinians, however, knowing those rules and procedures are not a luxury for a researcher like myself. They know them better than I describe them. It is necessary for their survival, their basic needs, and for their daily life. Let's assume again, get back to Smith. Smith may find it difficult to distinguish area A, B, and C. If he goes in a car with his 4 friends, Palestinian friends, he will probably know, as we like jokingly to say, he will know when we are in area A or when we get into area C, where Israeli police is present. He will know when everybody puts on their seatbelts. When you see everybody putting their seatbelts, the Palestinians, they know that. It's because they entered, we say, entered area C. That is, they may risk to get a fine. So he will follow the lead of his friends because they know that. So area A, B, C can be distinguished by the seatbelt. If he drives also with his, in his car with Palestinian friends, his friends may shout at him if inadvertently he takes a street with no sign on it saying forbidding to enter. But it happens that this street, his Palestinian friends know that, is a street that goes to a settlement. For Smith, this is any other street. This is a regular street that he can take. But his friends will start shouting at him because this is off limit for them as Palestinians to go through a street that leads to a settlement. Also, they will shout if he sees a checkpoint. We call it fixed, or flying, we call flying checkpoint. Flying checkpoint is any soldier, Israeli soldier, any place can stop you, and you need to stop. It's very risky not to stop. So Smith doesn't know that. He is raised in the UK. He has different perception of where police or how he can be stopped or arrested. So his friends will shout at them to stop every time he sees a flying checkpoint and wait until the soldier tells him to go. Sometimes to pass through a checkpoint you need, I didn't know that, my wife told me because she travels more than me in West Bank. Through a checkpoint you need to turn off the light of the car and turn on the light inside the car so as the soldiers can see you. This is very dangerous not to follow this rule. Nothing is stated anywhere. We don't know. We just live through those rules. While waiting on a checkpoint for security check, Smith's friends may tell him if he's driving a yellow license plate car, don't stay in this line. This is for Palestinians. Go to the other line for yellow plate cars. His friends, unfortunately, we can say it, may tell him, forget about this policeman if he's in area A. He can't do anything about you anyway. In other words, rather than answering the question who governs Palestine, the answer will largely depend on a case-by-case discovery, where the constitution is not known in advance. But this doesn't mean it is not known at all. Instead, one can say, case by case, with more or less confidence, you will know it when you see it. Can I have 3 minutes to finish the conclusion? I started this paper by asking, I forgot to, sorry. I'll give you the PowerPoint later on, but I forgot to switch to slides. The conclusion. I started this paper by asking who governs the West Bank and Gaza Strip and discussed the up-down approaches that I then considered as misleading and suggested a case-by-case approach where governance is better understood from the perspective of the governed individual, his existence, his rights and liberties. I can now safely conclude the following. The BA is not the only authority that governs the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It's not always precise, however, to consider the BA, as some tend to do, as a sub-government subordinated to the Israeli military governor. We like to say that now because we criticize the Palestinian Authority, and rightly so. In reality, despite the upper hand kept by the Israeli military, in particular for security issues, the PA enjoys in certain areas autonomous prerogatives that are enforced directly by the PA without the need of coordination with Israel. Of course, many other prerogatives are still subject to obligatory coordination with Israel. I talked about that too. But it's wrong to assume that the PA is part of the Israeli occupation authority or Israeli government. It's not a sub-authority. they have some prerogatives that are autonomous. Second, the Basic Law is only one of the many bases for government in Palestine. Sorry, it reminds me that I finished the 45 minutes. Not only that it has no value for Israeli military and civil administration in Area C and sometimes in Area A and B, it's not always the source of all powers exercised in the PA West Bank and in Hamas Gaza. Alternative sources include Israeli military orders still applied in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the PLO Charter, referred to it sometimes, Hamas Charter, Islamic Sharia generally, etc. Not to mention, of course, tribal customs. I talked about it in other research. We can talk about it in the discussion. It also includes various international treaties that apply in time of peace and occupation, in time of occupation and conflict. As a source of authority, the Basic Law wasn't a good one. It was part of the problem and contributed to reaching a deadlock in the Palestinian political system. 3, the transition to dictatorship and authoritarian character of government in the PA has nothing to do, or is not only related to culture and religion, as some often portray the Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims generally. The Palestinian Authority inherited legacies of the past, which are based on concentration of powers. As a result, discussion of reasons for such a transition, why transition in Egypt failed, why transition in Tunisia may fail, why transition? It's not because they are Arabs and Muslims. We need to study it from the perspective of the state authority, power relations, structural issues, and interests, including, of course, foreign countries like, in our case, Israel interest, where state security court was welcomed by the international community and the state of Israel, because it was a way to prosecute terrorists, Palestinian terrorists, by Palestinian Authority. And also local political and economic elites. We didn't discuss of this, we don't discuss about it, but many of the Palestinian elites, economic elites, have a stake in maintaining the status quo and in coordinating with Israel their benefits and maintaining the monopolies they have. Of course, there are tendencies to blame the people who elect democratically Hamas in 2006 as the origin of all evil for Palestinians. This is wrong. As we said, the 2007 coup didn't come out of the blank. It's related to all the legacies of the past, the fragmentation of the Palestinians. But there is one problem that I think is not dealt with enough. The way Hamas was integrated in the political system at first place. When Abbas, let's remember, it was Abbas in 2005 that insisted that Hamas should be included in the process. I believe he was wrong to change the Basic Law to integrate Hamas. He should have asked Hamas to change so as to integrate in the Basic Law system. But he didn't do that. That's why Hamas never committed to the PA framework of governance within the Basic Law. Never committed that future decisions will be taken within the political system of the PA. Never committed. And the first problem was when Ismail Haniyeh was to receive the confidence with the president, was that he didn't refer in his program to the PLO. For him, PLO, Hamas is not part of the PLO. Why should I refer to the PLO? It is often the case, I promise I finished, to conclusion. It is often the case that the PA is presented by Palestinians, at least, as an achievement. The international community and Israel have interest, I suspect, in maintaining that structure as much as the Palestinian leadership. In other words, the dissolution of the PA was really never an option. It was never an option. Even some academics, my colleagues in the university, and some politicians, they use it, but it's a threat. If it's used as a threat, it's because they know that there is a lot of interest into maintaining it. In reality, the status quo, I suspect, is candidate to remain as is, with possible intensification with time of the fragmentation that may lead to different arrangements for Gaza in the in the upcoming years, that Gaza will be forever, possibly, separated from the fate of the West Bank. With time, again, if this happens, it's not out of context. With time, the structure of the PA will stay, But the structure will change and increase the dependency on Israel and the international community, and the coordination with Israel will intensify. Different options are here possible for the West Bank. Maybe we'll discuss later on. Now, contrary to the prevailing narratives about the indispensability of the PA as a governing body, I suggest instead that the PA never really governed the West Bank and Gaza Strip. I put aside, of course, the Israeli direct to indirect control, but even in areas where the PA was supposed to govern, they didn't do that. This is the case, for example, in personal status affairs. It remained as is. Most decisions related to personal status remained as is. This is the case, you will be surprised, of most civil issues are governed by Ottomani Majalla still. Penal codes governed by Jordanian for West Bank and British in the Gaza didn't change. So if penal codes, civil matters are governed by previous by laws that were enforced before. Even municipalities, they are older than the PA, and they most likely remained mostly the same. So I suggest that instead of thinking why if the PA is indispensable to govern the West Bank and Gaza Strip, I suggest it really never did. This change of perspective on the way we look at the PA aims at switching narrative concerning the PA. It's not whether the PA will stay or not as a governing body. The question is how much it can maintain that little it governs. Thank you.
Thank you, Asem. So I would, go ahead and open the floor for questions. I saw, there's a blinking on webinar. Is there a question? Or, yeah. So the little message there is not a question. No. Okay. Please, we have two questions over there.
If PA decides to...
Can I have your name, please?
Abdul.
Abdul.
If PA decides, to abandon the government and leave it to Israel as such, I know that they've got vested interest as well, to keep it, because some of them are feather-bedded, with all the same. But there is a school of thought that if so much restrictions are placed, then whole thing can be referred to the Israeli government. You govern the things. Is it possible? It is likely?
Should we take a second question? Please, to your left.
Hi, I'm Ludovica.
Ludovica.
Well, it's more, I'm not an expert, but it's just a curiosity. So I was in Palestine in 2014, around, and I remember, not exactly, but I remember there was a discussion between the PA and Hamas to a kind of reunification, political reunification. Actually, it was just before the murder of the three guy in Hebron and everything. So I believe that after that, I believe nothing happened. But my question is a bit more general. So I can really see what you are saying about the willing of keeping the status quo and the fragmentation and the probably two situations for Gaza and the West Bank. But I really would like to have your point of view, if there is something that is possible to do to not follow this pattern that I feel as a terrible, terrible
Are you
result.
a political scientist?
I have this kind of, I have this background,
Because this is what political scientists do. They find solution. Jurists, they look at the problem. So I understand your question.
Or we create it.
Or we create it if there is none. But I'll try to say something.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So actually when we talk about possibility that Israel takes back its responsibility towards the occupied Palestinian Authority and the occupied territories, we need to distinguish between what many think this should be done or whether this will take place. So in my presentation, I suggested that I don't think this is coming. I don't think this is coming. The PA is subject or candidate to stay as is, although its role will intensify towards becoming a kind of a broker, a kind of intermediary to the Palestinian local population. If interested later on, I can go on and suggest what is the scenario I believe may take place. But this, I'll take the role of more political scientist than jurist.
What I think is they want to maintain PA
Yes.
as a status quo.
Yes.
Because they are feather
Yes,
bedded.
and they are strong. This tendency to maintain the status quo, I suggest, as you say, I suspect it is stronger than all calls for the dissolution of the PA. If they were serious, I suggested it wasn't serious. But even if they are serious, they cannot succeed because there are lots of interests at stake. Look at people working in the PA authority. We can afford anything but not having salaries arriving on time. So we don't like Abbas work, nor his attitude towards the resistance, nor his attitude towards dialogue or negotiation with Israel. But we almost forgive him because so far salaries arrived on time. Of course, I can't prove the correlation between two attitudes. But when Hamas was elected in 2006, the main problem for later on the problems is the boycott of the international community. Israel boycott, the tax, tax returns were not delivered to the government, so there were no salaries. And the thing that collapsed the system wasn't Hamas ideology that was put aside. It was the lack of salaries. People, they went on strike. So this is the kind of approach that I'm suggesting, to look at constitutions and governance from the perspective of interest of individuals and people's concern. You heard now about the recent decree law. Abbas adopted since 2007 more than 100 decree laws in all areas that you can suspect, nothing necessary. Oh, it's too much generalization. Not all of them are necessary to adopt in a decree law, because it should be necessary and indispensable because the PLC is not functioning. But the law that made it possible for thousands of peoples to go into the street, it's when it comes to their work-related stipends and returns, etc. So that's the kind of approach I suggest. It's not political, it's mostly interest-based that includes economic, but not only. It can be also religious affiliation is important. But it can be other things like gender issues also are important. All those aspects should be considered. I didn't consider them here. I didn't consider them so far in my research because so far I was busy doing as many others do, like looking at the text or looking at the actor's behavior, while the structure is much more complex than what we researchers are able to cover. The other question, the unity government, I mentioned Rami Hamdallah is now under a unity government with ministers technically from Gaza and West Bank, but they are not governing Gaza. Rami Hamdallah slept overnight, just one night in Gaza, and he left the other day because of problems with Hamas arrangement. Now, how we should do in order to change things? I can say you are not interested to hear my opinion because I disagree with almost everybody about this. Everybody is talking about the solution of the PA. I think this is unrealistic because there are many interests at stake. Many consider the PA as indispensable. I think this is wrong. We can get rid of the PA, nothing would change. I suspect. Municipalities will continue as they were. Civil affairs will be judged by judiciary. The same judges, by the way. They were under Israeli occupation and they are now working, functioning. criminal cases will be resolved as before. Municipalities will continue to deliver services as they are. By the way, the international aid community, when they were unhappy, whenever they were unhappy with the PA, they directly go to municipalities and they give them money for services. It's maintaining the population alive, the bare life idea, right? It will continue. So this approach is also, I suggest, is not going anywhere. The third approach that is often used, like an intifada, is coming. The stabbing of Israelis in the way that is done by individuals in that way is often looked at with enthusiasm. Finally, we got a third intifada because we are unhappy with the status quo, but we can't change it. So people think and encourage such, some people encourage such thing. I think this is wrong. This is just taking also the few things, the few agency we had as Palestinians. Now, again, I said again what I don't think is going to work. My personal opinion, I expressed it, and with frustration I received a negative feedback. I think Palestinians need to, I gave the example of someone who's living with his wife and his son in the house, and he just opened his eyes and find a thief, armed thief in the room. So resisting the thief is the most stupid idea he can have, because he's in a position of weakness. He is caught with his kids around, not armed, and that thief is armed, and he got the surprise element. So my suggestion is to stay cool. They call it steadfast.
Mm-hmm.
That is, stay cool. Try to maintain that thing that you have and wait a better time. It's like you are in the desert and there is a wind coming. The most stupid thing is that I'm strong, I can resist the wind. You can't. Just stay still until the wind goes. That's my suggestion. Am I arguing for maintaining the status quo? No. And I'm not sure what I'm arguing for, but I think that so far what we are doing is wrong.
How long we are going to go on tolerating the situation? Because a time will come, you see, because the way they are knifing now, you see, they take frustration.
You call it, yeah, right. My suggestion is the following. You called it, how long would we tolerate it? My suggestion is, do we have an alternative that is less catastrophic on people's lives and rights? And I'm just suggesting, really, I don't think the thief in the room is right. I don't think in the best situation, not defending your son, even if necessary, with an arm. Not defending yourself, self-defense, or your son. Imagine a father who can't defend his son. This is the worst thing that you can imagine. I have a 5-year-old son. This is the worst, not even to be attacked personally, but my son. I'm suggesting this is not something I like, but as the thief in the room, do I have an alternative that is less risky on my son, on myself? This is the approach that so far I couldn't convince anybody with it, but I need to work on it. That is it possible to think in that perspective? But the history of the Jewish people themselves is something like that. They waited. If this is their narrative, let's take their narrative. They waited until the time. So I'm suggesting not to forget about it, but just to wait the right moment.
So exactly, and then I'll go back to other questions, but just what you did in your paper seems to be exactly your response right now, right? So you're giving us a picture of the situation and you're somehow sketching the elements. In the seminar series, of course, we're interested in seeing how constitutions and governance work, right? So you're somehow describing what are the constraints on governance, and you looked at them, especially in the presentation. Now, in this last image that you used is somehow the getting ready part of the site, right? And you said we should get ready. So I wonder if the answer would be found in your own description. That is, once that you have identified the fact that there are a number of areas, they're not just territories, people, functions on which governance cannot be controlled, then should we think of, a way of devising a constitutional text that deals with what we can deal with and forget about the rest? Is that an option? Is that something that is in the subtext of what you're presenting?
This is what I suggested that the Palestinians did with the adoption of the basic law. And it worked for the purposes of adopting a basic law. Like, we don't talk about issues that we don't control. We don't refer to the territory. We don't refer to the people. We don't refer to the citizenship. What is there? What is in there still for constitution? Those are the elements that are indispensable for any constitution to make sense. So instead of adopting a problematic constitution, they opted to what you said. Now, this is an option that is adopted everywhere else. Usually when there is a constitution following a conflict, we avoid problematic matters. The Bill of Rights for the Americans is left for a couple of years after, almost 10 years, because they wanted to adopt a constitution that regulates the government. Then we talk about rights. There was an agreement that we will adopt them anyway sometime after that. The same in many contexts. We leave some issues unsettled because if we put them on the table, many problems will arise. I suggested that this is problematic. And it contributed, I wrote an article about it. It's called Beyond the Written Constitution, suggesting that most problematic issues that led in 2007 to the coup were not resolved politically within the basic law. When there is a conflict between the government and the president, can the government call for a referendum? We don't know. The basic law doesn't say anything. Shall we refer to the PLO or not? We don't know. The constitution doesn't say anything. So I suggested that, not that it is good or bad. I suggested that the fact that some elements are missing from the constitution enabled the adoption of a lovely constitution that even Hamas refers to. And Arafat, with some resistance, but finally he adopted it and used his prerogatives based on the basic law. He doesn't need to. He could use it from other perspective. But most of the problematic issues remained unsettled.
No, I was just going to say that I think Gianluca, correct me if I'm wrong, referred to a new constitution perhaps, that would partially in fact reflect on these issues, right?
Right, or to be ready, to use your so how do you get ready? So is thinking about governance or restructuring governance a way that is useful, or the scope is just so little because it's so narrow territorially, personally, functionally, that it actually has no, we should just forget about it and, let's leave governance and constitutions aside and move over. And then I have two questions over here.
Yeah, Nardini, this is going to be slightly from left field because I'm a philosopher, but interested in political philosophy. Nardini was the name. I was I'm not a Palestinian specialist at all. I was fascinated, though, methodologically by how one of the problems I find with constitutional theory and you might say positivism in constitutions is they often end up being the same thing because you're looking at the structure of what should be or the structure of what is, and it's still structure. The way you worked from the patterns of jurisdiction, patterns of how as a citizen of here or there negotiating in a kind of fabric, it reminds me, I work on Deleuze, of a sort of immanentist kind of plane of consistency. And I found it was very illuminating as a way of approaching a problem in governance rather than top-down, bottom-up. The way then suddenly you started talking about your thing of being in your house with your wife and the thief and waiting your time. This happens to be very much how I can understand Deleuze's being worthy of the event. It's actually because you have an immanentist understanding of the texture of how it feels to be on the ground in a state, you can actually somehow feel the event to find your time to make a constitution which you'll have eventually. Now that's an emotional understanding of what you said, but I found it very interesting.
Thank you. What's your name?
Nordini Kaur.
Kaur?
Kaur.
Kaur.
K-A-U-R. That's it. It was just a comment.
Thank you. I'm John. Asem, thank you very much for the paper. Nearly 20 years ago, I wrote an article which said that the basic law at the time was part of the process of liberating Palestinian legal culture. And I think that on reflection, one has to sort of be careful with that particular approach. I think on the one hand, what was important about the basic law was itself, its declaration. But like all constitutions or basic laws, it is rhetorical. It is not something which, like the American Constitution is a very good example, has no details of judicial review within the Constitution, something which is about later, and to some extent that was also sort of built in a sense to the Palestinian basic law. But the problem surely is that, unlike the American Constitution, Palestine wasn't an independent state. And although I think it's a state now, because the United Nations says it is, and we have no reason to challenge that, it's obviously an occupied state. And the question is how you can develop a constitution if you are not an independent state. Now, in South Africa, Mandela and the African National Congress were very clear that they would not agree to a constitution before there were free elections. In other words, without liberation, there can be no constitution. They were prepared to adopt a compromise constitution to oversee the elections. And once the election had taken place and the apartheid in that sense had ended, then they could freely adopt the constitution. So isn't the problem that actually the basic law is inflected with the consequences of the occupation? And that it's that circularity which I think is one of the great problems. And as you said yourself, not only is it inflected with the occupation, it's also inflected with the history of authoritarian constitutional rule.
Well, I'll connect between the two, and thank you for the comment, I appreciate it. The two comments, suggesting the following. Well, about the fact, what should we do? Can we or should we think about alternative, a new constitution possibly, and what to do in that sense to accommodate those pluralism or variety of situations. Well, this is a problem that I connect with the move to go to the UN and the so-called State of Palestine by UN resolution, that I was not at all in favor of doing it. And you will understand why, because of the following. Now, the State of Palestine was followed by the ratification of many treaties by decree, by Abbas. No internal mechanism for the ratification. So for me, the ratification even of human rights treaties was very authoritarian, not at all democratic. I may like it or not, this is not the issue. But it fits within the authoritarian structure, even the ratification of treaties. Another example. And it proves a little bit, I hope, that I was right. I didn't hope I was right, but all things going to that direction. Around the period where we intended to go to the Security Council, I was invited to make part of a new committee to draft the Constitution. I was one of 3 professors, constitutional law professors, to be invited to revise and revive a draft constitution from 2001, 2003, to make some amendments to it. So the first thing I asked Zanoun, the Palestinian National Council head of the Palestinian chairman, is this serious or is it related to going to the UN? He said, no, it's serious. We are serious. We want a constitution for the state. Since we have a state, or we will have a state, we need a constitution to be ready. Once we got the resolution, the committee was never called to convene. Few years after that, I received a new invitation by the Zanoun, or his advisor, to go and start talking again about it. It was the period where Hamas, Fatah almost reached an agreement about the government you talk about. So within that perspective, they wanted to revive. Why? Of course, we can reach an agreement with Hamas, but then we adopt a new constitution. Why? I was told personally, because I was part of the 3 persons who were asked to draft something for the Zanoun. They wanted to change the basic law to have a vice president. Because the current basic law says if the president's office is vacant, it's the PLC speaker who will be a temporary interim president. That is a DWIC, that is a Hamas. So what they really wanted, because there was an agreement to be reached, and Abbas is over 80, so he's not a young man anymore. Actually, he was never a young man when he reached the power. So they were afraid of the basic law, not because of rights, not because they wanted to function, not because they like it, or they don't like it, but because they wanted a vice president. And they proceeded. I personally, in the second time, I didn't participate. I say it always because I don't want my name to be put on a committee working with this mandate, with presidential mandate, serving political Fatah interests. Even, and this is something you may have heard about it, even the establishment of a constitutional court was part of the political conflict. You know, the Constitution refers to establishment of the Constitutional Court. And the Basic Law was adopted in 2002, amended in 2003. It already talks about the necessity to adopt a law, organic law, to establish a Constitutional Court. You know when it was adopted? It was adopted in a session by the Palestinian Legislative Council that was held few days after Fatah lost the election in 2006 and few days before the new Legislative Council made the oath. So the establishment of the Constitutional Court by law was done in a very problematic period and by a problematic law. 2006. There was no need since then by the president alone, who is responsible for nominating the judges. Since 2006, he didn't nominate the judges. Only a few months ago, he did so. And he nominated 7 judges from West Bank, Fatah affiliated, well-known Fatah affiliated lawyers and judges, and 2 from Gaza. You will be surprised. Usually we take half-half. Why 7-2? It's because the Constitutional Court cannot function as a court unless with 7 judges. And the 2 were rightly, actually, Hamas forbade the 2 to come to Ramallah for the oath. So now we have 7 who had made the oath and 2 no. So we have a court that can function with 7 judges from the West Bank. Many think that this is another way for President Abbas right now to impose by decree and legitimized by court. He himself nominated all Fatah members or professors of law or lawyers so as to maintain his control of the West Bank, including the possibility to dissolve the Palestinian Legislative Council and call for new election. Again, this seems very good. Why not to do a new election? Everybody's talking about it. They forget one thing. In 2007, Abbas changed electoral law. Make it possible. He made it possible for the first time because we had 2 elections and 2 different electoral laws. So every election we have a new law because it depends on the mood of the time. After 2007, after the coup, one of the first decree laws, you know why? It was electoral law. and it's almost passed, nobody noticed it. But that decree law actually made something very catastrophic and very problematic. It is now possible, it wasn't possible before, to make election even if all Gaza didn't participate in election. Because for the first time, according to this decree law, it will be based on lists and all Palestine as one circumscription district. So that's what law and constitution is there in a kind of authoritarian regime that John Straussen talked about. Within that perspective, even the most liberal constitutional text, the more inclusive constitutional text, and I'll mention one thing about, South Africa and no constitution before liberation and freedom. There was free election in 1996, but free election more or less like a free election within a prison. It is free in a prison. It's like prisoners electing their representatives. It's not liberating, but it's free. That's the problem with the Constitution. It includes all reference to freedom and to equality, but they forget about personal status law. What equality is, if when it comes to me marrying and hereditary rules, those basic choices are not included in the equality. I always say it, a Christian has an additional crime in Palestine, and rightly so. That is polygamy. Polygamy is a crime for a Christian, because personal status law for Muslims permit that it is not a crime. So this is one example of distributing rights and obligations, for example, based on religion. Gaza and West Bank have different criminal law. It means that a crime committed in Gaza may end up, because it's British mandate, few decades before, you may end up being having a death penalty in Gaza. But if it happens, you are lucky enough to kill someone, or in other circumstances do it in the West Bank, you may end up being put in prison, right? So even the distribution of death penalties is not equal. So what equality? That's what I mean, that all in the details.
Thank you. I think that you also somehow sketched, and it came back in the comments, the amount and degree of constraints. And so we're very much focusing on the Palestinian case, right? But if you actually broaden up, if you zoom out and you look at other experiences, the degree of, it's just a matter of degree of constraints, because this, the entire constitution making and the design of a governance structure never happens in a perfect world. And actually most of scholarship actually says that actually when you need to have all the, the good, conditions to write a constitution, that's when it never happens. So it's always a matter of degrees of constraints, and clearly in the Palestinian case, the amount of constraints is even greater or more evident from the outsider perspective, right? So the observer perceives more the constraints, but it's not that the constraints are not there when you're actually designing a governance system, for instance, in a liberating or a liberated context. So I think that, for the purpose of our reflection on governance and constitution, is also, it's particularly useful to see those constraints at work in the Palestinian context. But and there's certainly something that is very specific about Palestine. But the problems with governance and constitution making are not necessarily just the Palestinian problem, because of the occupation and because of the division and because of that. So the fact that, reflecting on the Palestinian case helps us see those constraints. But once we train our eyes to actually see those constraints, then we can also see them in other contexts, and where constraints are maybe under the surface, but are still there. And you pointed to the, to the political orientations, to the political immediate gains of actors in the constitution making, in the constitution drafting, who's called to the drafting committee with what goal in what specific, momentous or momentum. So thank you for bringing our attention to this key point in, again, the relationship between governance and constitutions, and good luck with your work in whatever function you will be in Palestine. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much.